Xander Hamilton was 42 years old, and to most people in Columbus, Ohio, just another operations director with a quiet life. His neighbors saw the same aging Ford Explorer every morning. His co-workers watched him eat lunch at the same diner 3 blocks from the office. Even his wife, Brooke, often spoke as if she were the more successful one. What nobody knew was that nearly every major asset connected to their lifestyle belonged to a holding company that had existed long before their marriage. Then, one Tuesday night, Xander opened Facebook and saw Brooke's divorce filing posted for thousands to see. His full name was exposed. A list of assets filled the screen. His eyes stopped on one specific line, and suddenly he understood how badly she had miscalculated. If you're watching from somewhere in the world, leave a comment with your country and your local time right now. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is joining from. And if you enjoy stories about patient strategy and truth winning without shouting, consider subscribing to the channel. There's a lot more ahead in Xander Hamilton's story. The notification arrived while Xander Hamilton was halfway through a plate of grilled chicken and mashed potatoes at Buckeye Junction, a small diner on the west side of Columbus. The place was quiet for a Tuesday evening. Country music drifted softly from ceiling speakers. A waitress refilled coffee at the counter. Nothing about the room suggested that the next few minutes would change the direction of an already ugly divorce. Xander's phone vibrated once, then again, then 5 times in less than 20 seconds. He frowned. That alone was unusual. Most people didn't text him often. He wasn't active on social media, he wasn't part of group chats. He rarely posted anything online beyond an occasional company announcement. The screen lit up. The first message came from an old college friend. "You need to see this." Below it was a Facebook link. The second message was shorter. "Call me when you can." The third contained only 3 words. "What is Brooke doing?" Xander set his fork down. A strange stillness settled over him. Years of business negotiations had taught him something valuable. When several people suddenly react to the same event, the event is usually worse than it first appears. He opened the link. For a moment, he simply stared. The post belonged to Brooke Hamilton. Her profile picture showed her smiling beside a beach resort pool in Naples, Florida. The post itself had already gathered hundreds of reactions. The number continued climbing while he watched. Then he started reading. At first, it looked like a personal statement. Several paragraphs, emotionally written, carefully crafted. The kind of post designed to gather sympathy before facts. Brooke described herself as a woman who had spent years supporting a husband who allegedly hid money from her. She claimed she was fighting for fairness. She claimed she was finally standing up for herself. Then came the documents. Several screenshots, several pages, official court filings. And there, centered near the top of the first page, was the name Xander James Hamilton. Fully visible. No redactions. No attempt to hide personal information, nothing. The filing included their case number, their attorneys' names, their county, their marital history. And then came the list. Xander scrolled slowly. House in Upper Arlington, lake property in Michigan, commercial real estate holdings, investment accounts, business equity, vehicle assets, retirement reserves, corporate interests. The list stretched on. Brooke had highlighted sections in yellow before uploading them. Almost like a presentation. Almost like evidence she wanted the internet to examine. The comments underneath were worse. Far worse. People who knew neither side had already reached conclusions. He looks like every other guy hiding money. Take him for everything. Men like this always think they're smarter. Hope she gets every dollar. Expose him. Some comments were from strangers, others were not. Xander recognized names. Neighbors. Former acquaintances. People Brooke had met at charity events, parents from local school fundraisers, individuals who had shared drinks with them during vacations, people who had smiled at him in person. Now, they were discussing him as if he were a criminal. He continued scrolling. The post had already been shared dozens of times, then hundreds. A local lifestyle page had reposted it. Another community group had copied screenshots. Someone had uploaded the filing to X. Someone else had posted it to Reddit. The spread was accelerating, a digital wildfire, and Brooke had lit the match herself. The waitress approached. "You okay, honey?" Xander looked up. For a second, she seemed concerned. He offered a polite smile. "I'm fine." She nodded and walked away. He wasn't fine, but panic wasn't useful. Never had been. His eyes moved back to the documents. He zoomed in. Carefully, methodically, page by page, line by line. Most people reading the filing saw wealth. They saw dollar signs. They saw houses and investments. Xander saw something different. Mistakes. Several of them. Large mistakes hidden inside the very documents Brooke had proudly published. The first involved ownership descriptions. The second involved entity names. The third involved signatures. By the time he reached page 6, he had stopped reading as a husband. He was reading as someone who had spent years protecting corporate structures. His expression didn't change. But something inside him became very quiet, very focused. He finished the post, then started again. This time, taking screenshots. Every page, every comment, every share count, every visible username. He created folders, saved backups, uploaded copies to secure cloud storage, recorded timestamps. Nothing dramatic, no angry response, no emotional post, no public defense, just documentation. The process took nearly 40 minutes. When he finished, he paid his bill and walked outside. The evening air was cool. Traffic moved steadily along Broad Street. The city looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier, but his life did not. His phone rang. The caller ID displayed a familiar name, Victoria Hayes. Xander answered immediately. "I figured you'd call." Victoria's voice carried decades of courtroom experience. Calm, measured, never rushed. "I've already seen it. You have 3 people sent it to me before you did." That surprised him, only slightly. "What do you think?" There was a brief pause. "I think your wife just created several legal problems for herself." Xander leaned against his vehicle. Across the street, headlights reflected off storefront windows. "What kind of problems?" "Privacy issues." She paused. "Potential violations regarding court documents." Another pause. "And possibly something even bigger." Xander waited. Victoria continued. "Tell me something." "What?" "Did she upload the entire filing herself?" "Looks like it." "No edits?" "No." "Interesting." The word carried weight. Victoria rarely used dramatic language. If she sounded interested, there was a reason. "What are you seeing?" Xander asked. "I'm seeing someone who wanted public support more than legal protection." He looked down at the screenshots again. The highlighted sections, the signatures, the attached exhibits, the names. Everything Brooke had exposed. Everything she wanted the public to see. And maybe a few things she never intended anyone to notice. Victoria spoke again. "Whatever happens next, do not respond online." "I wasn't planning to." "Good. Don't argue." "I won't." "Don't defend yourself." "Understood." "Don't contact Brooke about the post." Xander nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Okay." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Victoria's tone shifted. Just slightly. Enough for him to notice. "Xander." "Yeah. I want every screenshot saved." "Already done." "Every comment. Done. Every repost you can find. I'm working on it. Good. Silence followed. Then she said something that made him glance back at the glowing screen of his phone, something that changed the way he viewed the entire situation, something that transformed Brooke's post from an embarrassment into a potential weapon against her own case. Victoria said quietly, "This may become the biggest mistake she has made since filing for divorce." Xander looked again at the highlighted list of assets. The houses, the investments, the companies, the properties Brooke believed she was exposing, and for the first time that evening he began to suspect she had absolutely no idea who actually owned them. Xander Hamilton first met Brooke Sullivan 11 years earlier in Cleveland. The event took place inside a renovated warehouse overlooking the Cuyahoga River. A children's cancer foundation had organized a fundraising gala. Local business owners, medical executives, attorneys, real estate developers. Several hundred people filled the building. Brooke stood out immediately, not because she was the most beautiful woman in the room. There were others who could have competed for that title. What made Brooke noticeable was her ability to command attention. She moved through conversations effortlessly, remembered names, laughed at the right moments, made people feel important. The room seemed to bend toward her. Xander noticed her, then went back to the conversation he was having with the hospital administrator. That, ironically, was what attracted Brooke. Most men approached her. Xander didn't. Most men tried to impress her. Xander appeared completely uninterested in doing so. Hours later, she approached him herself. The conversation lasted less than 15 minutes, yet it lingered in her mind long afterward. He wasn't flashy, wasn't loud, didn't talk about money, didn't mention accomplishments, didn't name-drop important people. In a room full of individuals trying to prove something, he seemed entirely comfortable proving nothing. Brooke found that intriguing. Their first date happened 2 weeks later. Then another, then another. By the end of the year, they were serious. By the second year, they were engaged. From the outside, the relationship looked ideal. They rarely fought, neither had children. Both were educated, both appeared successful. Friends described them as balanced, compatible, stable. But even in those early years, there was one assumption quietly growing beneath the surface. Brooke believed she understood exactly who Xander was. She believed he was a successful middle management executive. Smart, reliable, comfortable, financially secure, but ordinary. That assumption would eventually become the foundation of every mistake she made. The truth was more complicated. Xander never lied to her, not once, but he also never volunteered information people didn't ask for. When Brooke asked where he worked, he answered honestly. When she asked about his role, he answered honestly. When she asked where he lived, he answered honestly. The pattern continued throughout their relationship. She asked simple questions. He gave simple answers. What she never did was ask deeper questions. Questions about ownership, questions about structure, questions about the companies connected to his family, questions about why certain assets existed, questions about why some documents carried unfamiliar names. Those details never interested her. Not then. The first years of marriage passed comfortably. The couple purchased a home in Upper Arlington, a beautiful property on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees. The house impressed visitors. 4 bedrooms, custom kitchen, finished basement, large backyard. The kind of home people associated with wealth. Brooke certainly did. Whenever friends complimented the property, she smiled proudly. Sometimes she described it as our house. Sometimes she referred to it as the home we built together. Xander never corrected her. There never seemed to be a reason. The same pattern repeated elsewhere, the lake house in northern Michigan, the investment portfolio, the commercial properties, the luxury SUV she drove, the vacation homes they rented during summer. Brooke saw lifestyle. Xander saw paperwork. Two entirely different perspectives. Over time, those differences became more noticeable. Not because of money, because of attention. Brooke enjoyed attention. She enjoyed social media, she enjoyed recognition. She enjoyed being associated with success. Her Instagram account grew steadily. Photos from charity events. Photos from vacations. Photos from restaurants. Photos from wine tastings. Photos beside expensive vehicles. Thousands of followers eventually accumulated. Xander rarely appeared in the pictures, and when he did, he often looked uncomfortable. He disliked public exposure. He disliked broadcasting personal information. Most of all, he disliked unnecessary attention. That preference had deep roots. Years earlier, before Brooke entered his life, Xander had watched his father lose almost everything. Not because of business failure, not because of bad investments, because of litigation. A single lawsuit, a single dispute. A single moment when assets that appeared protected turned vulnerable. The experience shaped the Hamilton family permanently. They became cautious, deliberate, protective. Every major acquisition afterward followed a specific structure. Lawyers, accountants, corporate entities, asset separation, risk management, everything documented, everything organized, everything legal. That system eventually evolved into Hamilton Crest Holdings, LLC, a company few people knew existed, even fewer understood. For Xander, the holding company wasn't a symbol of wealth. It was a shield, a firewall, a lesson learned from painful experience. For Brooke, it was little more than a name, occasionally appearing on paperwork she barely read. Years passed. The marriage remained outwardly successful. But subtle changes emerged. The first signs appeared around year 7. Brooke became increasingly interested in comparisons. Who earned more? Who owned more? Which couples traveled more? Which friends upgraded homes? Which families appeared more successful online? Social media amplified everything. Every vacation became a benchmark. Every achievement became a competition. Every purchase became a statement. Xander remained largely unchanged. He still drove practical vehicles, still wore inexpensive watches, still preferred quiet weekends, still spent evenings reviewing reports instead of browsing social media. The contrast widened. Then came conversations about status. At first, they seemed harmless. Brooke would mention friends whose husbands ran companies, friends whose names appeared in magazines, friends whose businesses received public recognition. She never directly criticized Xander. Not initially. Instead, she framed things as observations, comparisons, questions, small remarks. Have you ever thought about starting your own company? Why don't you network more? You know people would respect you more if they knew what you've accomplished. Xander usually smiled, then changed the subject. He wasn't interested in public validation. Brooke increasingly was. The difference created distance neither fully acknowledged. By year 9, arguments became more frequent, still controlled, still civilized, but more frequent. Most centered around visibility, recognition, perception, not money itself, what money represented. One evening after a charity event in Columbus, Brooke made a comment that lingered in Xander's memory. They were driving home. Downtown lights reflected across the windshield. Brooke stared out the passenger window. Then she said quietly, "Sometimes I feel like nobody knows who we are." The statement surprised him. "We know who we are." "That's not what I mean." "What do you mean?" She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded distant. "I mean, people with half our lifestyle get 10 times the attention." Xander understood something in that moment. not everything, but enough. They weren't measuring success using the same scale anymore. Months later, the word divorce appeared for the first time. Not during a fight, not during a dramatic confrontation, just casually, almost experimentally, as though Brooke wanted to see how it sounded. Xander remembered the moment clearly. She had mentioned a friend going through a divorce, then added, "Sometimes starting over isn't the worst thing." He glanced toward her. She smiled, but the smile never reached her eyes. The conversation moved on, yet the idea remained, growing, quietly, steadily, like a crack beneath a foundation. Years later, when divorce finally became reality, Brooke believed she knew exactly what stood on the other side. She believed she understood the assets, the wealth, the ownership, the leverage. She believed she knew the game. What she didn't realize was that she had spent more than a decade looking at a structure she never truly understood. And now, after posting those documents online, she had unknowingly invited everyone else to examine it too, including people who knew far more than she did. Victoria Hayes arrived at her downtown Columbus office before 7 the next morning. The city was still waking up. Traffic along High Street remained light. Coffee shops were opening their doors. Office towers reflected pale sunlight across the glass skyline. Inside Hayes' legal group, however, the day had already begun. A stack of documents waited on Victoria's conference table. Printed screenshots, court filings, corporate records, copies of Brooke Hamilton's social media posts, and a thick binder that had not been opened in years. The binder belonged to Xander. Specifically, it belonged to a period of his life most people never discussed: his marriage paperwork. Victoria removed her glasses and opened to the first section. Prenuptial agreement, signed 11 years earlier. Every page initialed, every signature notarized, every disclosure acknowledged. Nothing unusual. Nothing dramatic, exactly the kind of document wealthy families paid attorneys to prepare. The difference was that most people never bothered reading them after signing. Victoria suspected Brooke had been one of those people. Her suspicion grew stronger with every page she reviewed. At 9 o'clock, Xander arrived. He entered carrying coffee from Staff's. Same calm expression. Same measured pace. Same lack of visible emotion. Victoria appreciated that about him. Many clients became irrational once divorce entered the picture. Xander did not. He preferred facts. Facts were easier to work with. She slid several pages across the table. "You need to look at this." Xander sat down. His eyes moved across the documents. "What am I looking at?" "Your wife's Facebook post." "I've already seen it." "Not like this." Victoria tapped a highlighted section. "Look closer." He leaned forward. For several seconds neither spoke, then he noticed it. A small detail, easy to miss, potentially devastating. Brooke had uploaded complete scans of the filing. Not excerpts, not summaries. Complete scans. Including supporting exhibits, including signature pages, including acknowledgement forms, including sections most attorneys would have redacted before sharing publicly. Victoria pointed toward one specific page. "Remember this?" Xander nodded immediately. It was part of the prenuptial package. A disclosure acknowledgement. One page among dozens. Simple, straightforward, legally significant. The document confirmed that Brooke had received independent legal advice before signing. It confirmed she had been given adequate time to review the agreement. It confirmed she understood the distinction between marital assets and separately owned property. And most importantly, it contained her signature, the same signature she had just published online. The same signature attached to a statement acknowledging she understood the structure of Hamilton Crest Holdings. Victoria leaned back. She posted proof. Proof of what? Proof that she was informed. Xander remained silent. Victoria continued. Her public argument right now is that you hid assets. Right. These documents show she knew certain assets were not personally owned by you. The room grew quiet. The implications settled slowly. Not because the logic was complicated, because it was so simple. Brooke's online narrative depended upon the claim that Xander concealed information. The documents she uploaded suggested the opposite. Victoria opened another folder. More paperwork, more exhibits, more disclosures. There's something else. Xander looked up. Victoria placed another page in front of him. This one came from years earlier. Property documentation. The Upper Arlington house. The property Brooke repeatedly described online as our marital home. The deed told a different story. Owner Hamilton Crest Holdings, LLC. Acquisition date 3 years before the marriage. Xander stared at it. Not surprised, just confirming. Victoria spoke carefully. Do you know what most people see when they read her post? They see wealth. Exactly. She tapped the deed. I see ownership. Another document appeared. The Michigan Lake property. Again. Hamilton Crest Holdings, LLC. Another, commercial office space near Cincinnati, same result. Another, investment reserve accounts, corporate ownership, not personal ownership. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. Brooke had created a public list of assets, but she had never actually verified who owned them. The distinction mattered. In divorce court, ownership mattered more than perception. Much more. Xander folded his hands. What do you think Preston is doing right now? Victoria smiled faintly. Preston Cole, Brooke's attorney, a capable lawyer, aggressive, media savvy, not reckless, unlike his client. If he's competent, he's nervous. Xander raised an eyebrow. Why? Because his client just published evidence without legal review. That answer made perfect sense. Attorneys controlled information for a reason. Court filings often contained details that looked helpful until examined closely. Once information became public, it became difficult to control. And Brooke had released everything. Not only to her friends, not only to her followers, to everyone. Victoria turned her laptop around. A Facebook analytics page filled the screen. The numbers had grown overnight. Shares, comments, reposts, mentions. The post was spreading. Fast. Several local blogs had already picked it up. A small online publication in Columbus published an article titled, Local Woman Claims Husband Hid Millions During Marriage. Another site published screenshots. Another copied portions of the filing. Another embedded the original post. The story had become entertainment, and the internet loved entertainment, especially when money and divorce were involved. Victoria closed the laptop. That creates another problem. What problem? Damages. Xander looked at her. She continued. Those posts mention specific properties. Okay. They mention corporate holdings. Okay. They identify entities. Now he understood. Not completely, but enough. Hamilton Crest Holdings wasn't a personal diary, it was a business, a legal entity, a company connected to employees. Partners, vendors, clients, investors. Reputation mattered, public accusations mattered, especially when attached to claims of fraud or concealment. Victoria opened another folder. Inside were several emails received overnight. One came from a regional banking partner. Another from a commercial insurance carrier. A third from a logistics client. All asking questions. All referencing Brooke's allegations. The consequences had already begun. Not catastrophic, not yet, but real. Very real. Xander read silently, then set the pages down. What happens next? Victoria answered immediately. We wait. Many people hated that answer. Xander didn't. Waiting was easier when facts favored you. Preston will review these documents. Probably. He'll realize the ownership issue. Definitely. And Brooke? Victoria considered the question, then shook her head. I don't think she understands what she's done. The statement wasn't cruel, just honest. Brooke appeared convinced that possession and ownership were identical, that using something meant owning it, that living somewhere meant having legal claim to it. Reality often worked differently. Corporate law certainly did. Victoria stood and walked toward the window. Below them, Columbus moved through another ordinary workday. Cars, pedestrians, delivery trucks, routine. Meanwhile, a legal disaster was quietly building. Not for Xander. For Brooke, the irony was impossible to ignore. She had posted those documents believing they strengthened her position, believing public opinion would pressure the court, believing exposure created leverage. Instead, the documents were creating a paper trail, a trail leading directly back to her own signatures, her own acknowledgments, her own disclosures. Victoria turned back toward the table. There is one thing I'm certain about. What? The court is eventually going to see all of this. Xander nodded. Good. Victoria studied him. Most men facing public humiliation wanted revenge. Most wanted to fight. Most wanted to answer accusations immediately. Xander wanted something else. Accuracy, truth, documentation. Nothing more, nothing less. His phone buzzed. A new notification. Another repost, another article, another discussion thread. The story continued spreading. He looked at the screen briefly, then locked the phone again. Victoria noticed. Not worried, Xander thought for a moment, then answered quietly, I'm worried about facts, not opinions. No. He looked toward the stack of documents, toward Brooke's signatures, toward the pages she had chosen to publish, toward the evidence she never realized she was providing, and for the first time since the divorce began, he felt something shift. Not confidence, not relief, something closer to certainty. Because the more attention Brooke attracted, the more people would eventually examine the details. And details were exactly where her story began to fall apart. 3 days after Brooke's post went viral, Xander drove north towards Delaware County. The destination wasn't a courthouse, wasn't a bank, wasn't even Victoria's office. It was a modest 2-story brick building located behind a row of medical offices. Most people would have driven past it without noticing. No flashy signage, no luxury entrance, just a bronze plaque mounted beside a glass door. Hamilton Crest Holdings, LLC. The company name meant almost nothing to the public. That was intentional. The less attention the company attracted, the better. Xander parked near the rear entrance and walked inside. The receptionist greeted him with a familiar smile. Morning, Mr. Hamilton. Morning, Rachel. He moved through the hallway and entered a conference room overlooking a small pond behind the property. A few minutes later, 3 other people joined him. Thomas Reed, Chief Financial Officer, 56 years old. Former corporate auditor, extremely detail-oriented. Melissa Grant, corporate counsel, sharp, methodical, known for finding problems before they became lawsuits. And David Holloway, outside tax advisor. One of the few people who fully understood the structure behind Hamilton Crest Holdings. The atmosphere was serious, not because the company was in danger, because public attention always created risk. Thomas opened a folder. We've received 17 inquiries since the Facebook post. Xander listened quietly. From clients. 5 clients. Others. Banks, vendors, insurance carriers. Melissa slid another document across the table. 3 of them specifically referenced Brooks' allegations. Xander read the pages. Questions about ownership, questions about transparency, questions about corporate governance. Nothing catastrophic, nothing threatening. Yet. But reputation moved markets. Sometimes faster than facts. Melissa folded her hands. The company isn't facing legal exposure. Good. At least, not from what we've seen. She paused. The concern is perception. That word again. Perception. The same force that had quietly damaged Xander's marriage. The same force Brooks seemed obsessed with controlling. The same force that now threatened to create unnecessary complications. Thomas leaned forward. I think it's time we discuss the history. No one disagreed. The history mattered, especially now. Especially because Brooke had built her entire public narrative around assumptions. Assumptions that ignored how Hamilton Crest Holdings actually existed. The company had been created nearly 14 years earlier, long before Xander married Brooke, long before she entered his life, long before the Upper Arlington home, long before the lake house, long before social media became part of everyday life. The origin story began with Xander's father, James Hamilton, a respected entrepreneur who spent decades building a regional transportation company throughout Ohio. By most measures, James succeeded. Then one lawsuit nearly destroyed everything. The dispute itself wasn't extraordinary. A contract disagreement, several parties, years of litigation, millions in legal expenses. The case eventually settled. But the experience changed the Hamilton family forever. James survived financially. Barely. The lesson stayed with him. Ownership and control were not the same thing. Personal assets and business assets should never live under the same roof. Protection required structure. Structure required discipline. That philosophy became the foundation of Hamilton Crest Holdings. The company wasn't created to hide wealth. It was created to separate risk. Every attorney involved documented that purpose. Every accountant reinforced it. Every acquisition followed the same process. The Upper Arlington property, purchased by the company, not by Xander. The Michigan Lake House, purchased by the company, not by Xander. Several investment accounts, owned by the company, not by Xander. Commercial real estate, company owned, company managed, company maintained. The pattern never changed. David Holloway opened another folder. Corporate records filled the table. Operating agreements, purchase contracts, ownership ledgers, tax filings. Every document supported the same conclusion. The company existed independently, legally, financially, operationally. Xander had influence. He had leadership responsibilities. He had voting authority. But ownership remained inside the entity itself. David adjusted his glasses. From a legal standpoint, the structure is extremely clean. Melissa nodded. That's why Brooks' claims are problematic. Not because they were dangerous, because they were inaccurate. Public accusations didn't need to be true to cause damage. They only needed attention, and Brooke had generated plenty of that. Xander looked toward the window. The pond outside remained still. A pair of ducks moved across the surface. The peaceful scene contrasted sharply with the chaos online. His phone buzzed again. Another notification. Another mention. Another discussion thread. He ignored it. Thomas noticed. Still not reading comments. No. Probably smart. Xander didn't respond. He understood something many people didn't. Attention was addictive. Especially negative attention. The temptation to defend yourself often created bigger problems. Silence frustrated people. Facts exhausted them. Eventually, one replaced the other. Melissa opened a separate folder. Inside were copies of the prenuptial disclosures. Brooke's signatures appeared throughout the packet, page after page, acknowledgement after acknowledgement, disclosure after disclosure. Nothing hidden, nothing ambiguous. One section specifically referenced Hamilton Crest Holdings. Another identified company-owned assets. Another distinguished personal property from corporate property. Melissa tapped one page. She signed this. Everyone looked. A simple statement. Clear language. Easy to understand. The document confirmed that Brooke had reviewed ownership disclosures before marriage. Not once. Multiple times. She had initialed the page, signed it, had it notarized. Years later, she claimed ignorance. The paperwork suggested otherwise. Thomas shook his head slowly. Did she ever actually read any of this? No one answered. The question didn't matter anymore. Legally, signatures mattered more than memory. David turned another page, then paused. His expression changed, only slightly, enough for Xander to notice. What? David removed a document from the folder. An old email, dated almost 6 years earlier. He scanned it again, then looked up. This is interesting. Melissa leaned forward. What is it? David handed over the page. Silence followed. A different kind of silence. The kind attorneys recognized immediately. The kind that often preceded breakthroughs. Melissa read carefully, then read again. Her eyebrows lifted. Where did this come from? Archived correspondence, Xander watched them. What am I missing? Melissa looked toward him. This email was sent from Brooke. That alone wasn't unusual. Over the years, Brooke had exchanged countless emails involving properties, vacations, renovations, and financial matters. But this email was different. Very different. Melissa slid the document toward Xander. The message had been sent to a banking relationship manager. The subject line was simple: ownership transfer questions. Xander began reading. The email itself was short, professional, direct. Brooke asked whether assets owned by Hamilton Crest Holdings could eventually be transferred into personal ownership. She specifically referenced the Michigan Lake House. She specifically referenced company-held property, and most importantly, she referred to those assets as company-owned, not personally owned. The room remained silent as Xander reached the final line. Then he looked up. Nobody needed to explain why the document mattered. Its significance was obvious. 6 years earlier, Brooke clearly understood the distinction. She knew the assets belonged to the company. She acknowledged it in writing. She asked questions about it. She discussed it. Now, she was publicly claiming confusion. The contradiction couldn't have been clearer. Melissa carefully placed the email inside a separate evidence folder. Victoria needs this immediately. David nodded. So does the court. Xander looked at the document one last time, then back toward the window. The pond remained calm. The ducks continued moving across the water. Outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. Because for the first time since Brooke posted the divorce documents, there was now direct evidence that she had understood the ownership structure years before filing for divorce. Evidence didn't argue. Evidence didn't shout. Evidence didn't post online. Evidence simply waited. And this particular piece of evidence had just begun speaking. The first podcast episode appeared 8 days after Brooke's Facebook post. By then, the story had already spread far beyond her social circle. Local blogs had picked it up. Community forums were discussing it. Several online gossip accounts had reposted screenshots of the divorce filing. What began as a personal dispute was slowly becoming public entertainment, and Brooke seemed determined to keep it that way. Xander discovered the podcast while reviewing emails early on a Thursday morning. The link came from Victoria. No explanation. Just a single sentence. Listen to minute 14. He clicked play. The show was called Columbus Unfiltered, a locally produced podcast that specialized in personal stories, neighborhood controversies, and trending community topics. The host introduced Brooke warmly, almost sympathetically. The interview began casually. Questions about relationships, questions about trust, questions about betrayal. Then the conversation moved exactly where everyone expected. Toward Xander, toward money, toward divorce. Xander listened without expression. Brooke described years of frustration, years of confusion, years of allegedly being excluded from financial decisions. She never accused him of a crime directly. She was smarter than that. Instead, she used implication, suggestion, carefully chosen language. The host helped. Do you believe your husband intentionally concealed assets? A pause. Then Brooke answered, I believe there are things I was never told. The statement sounded reasonable. That was what made it effective. People rarely questioned implications. They filled in the blanks themselves. Another question followed. Do you think he's hiding money? Another pause, another carefully crafted answer. I think the court will eventually reveal the truth. Again. No direct accusation, but the audience understood exactly what she wanted them to believe. Xander skipped ahead. The interview continued for nearly an hour. The pattern never changed. Hints, suggestions, implications. Enough to shape public opinion. Not enough to create immediate legal liability, at least in theory. When the episode ended, Xander set down his phone. The kitchen remained quiet. Outside, morning traffic moved along Riverside Drive. Nothing about the scene reflected the chaos building online. His phone rang. Victoria. What did you think? She asked. She's careful. Very. Too careful. Victoria paused. Maybe. That answer intrigued him. How so? People think being indirect protects them. And it doesn't. It depends. Victoria sounded thoughtful. The problem isn't what she said. Then what is it? The pattern. Xander understood. Individual statements often meant little. Patterns meant everything. A single implication might be harmless. Dozens created intent. And intent mattered, especially when combined with public campaigns. Victoria continued. There's someone else involved. Who? Tyler Benson. The name was unfamiliar. Who is he? Public relations consultant. That explained a lot. Victoria had already investigated. Tyler Benson specialized in reputation management, personal branding, crisis communication, online influence campaigns. His clients ranged from local politicians to business owners, and apparently now included Brooke. The discovery made sense. The Facebook post, the podcast, the timing, the messaging, none of it felt accidental. It felt coordinated. A strategy, not a reaction. Later that afternoon, Xander arrived at the logistics company where he worked. The building sat on the northeast side of Columbus. A practical facility, no luxury offices, no marble lobby, just efficient operations. The way Xander preferred. He had barely reached his office when Human Resources called. The meeting lasted 15 minutes. His supervisor attended, HR attended, a corporate attorney attended remotely. Everyone remained polite, professional, uncomfortable. Finally, the HR director spoke. We have a situation. Xander nodded. I assumed as much. The director sighed. We've received inquiries. From clients. Some. Others. Industry partners. Not surprising. The story was spreading. People Googled names. Names led to employers. Employers received questions. That was how public controversies worked. The director folded her hands. We don't believe you've done anything wrong. But But perception matters. There was that word again, perception, always perception. The director continued, "We'd like to place you on temporary administrative leave." The statement hung in the room. Not disciplinary, not punitive, protective. Still unpleasant. Most people would have argued. Most would have defended themselves. Most would have demanded fairness. Xander simply nodded. For how long? A few weeks? He stood. Understood. The director looked almost relieved. "You don't want to discuss it, no. You're sure?" "Yes." Because discussion wouldn't change facts. Facts existed independently of emotions. Arguing with perception rarely improved perception. Outside the building, Xander sat in his vehicle for several minutes. Not angry, not defeated, just thoughtful. His professional reputation had taken a hit. Not because of evidence, not because of misconduct, because of assumptions. The realization wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't surprising either. Meanwhile, across Columbus, Brooks' campaign continued expanding. New interviews, new posts, new appearances. The audience kept growing. So did the attention. For a short time, the strategy appeared successful. People supported her. Commenters praised her courage. Followers increased. Local media requested interviews. The spotlight intensified. And Brooke stepped further into it. What she didn't know was that someone else had started paying attention. Someone with no connection to the divorce. No connection to Xander. No connection to Hamilton Crest Holdings. His name was Ethan Walsh. A journalist, 48 years old. Investigative reporter. Former staff writer for the Columbus Dispatch. Unlike bloggers and podcasters, Ethan had a habit of verifying things before publishing them. An increasingly rare habit. The story first caught his attention because of the documents. Most people focused on the allegations. Ethan focused on paperwork, specifically ownership records. One evening, he sat at his desk reviewing property databases, public filings, corporate registrations, basic research, the kind reporters used to perform routinely. Within an hour, he noticed something strange. The ownership records didn't match the narrative. The Upper Arlington Property Company owned. The Lake House Company owned. Several other listed assets. Same pattern. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Interesting. Very interesting. The public story described hidden marital wealth. The records described corporate ownership. Those were not necessarily the same thing. The distinction deserved investigation. For the first time since Brooks' campaign began, an outsider was examining the facts instead of the headlines. That development mattered, because journalists could amplify stories, but they could also dismantle them. The following day, Ethan placed a call. Not to Brooke, not to Xander, to the Franklin County Recorder's Office. Then another call, then another. More documents, more confirmations, more inconsistencies. The deeper he looked, the less convinced he became. Meanwhile, Xander remained unaware of Ethan's research. He spent his days working with Victoria, collecting records, preserving evidence, preparing for court. The process felt slow, methodical, necessary. One evening, Victoria called with an update. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine." "You sound tired." "I am." She laughed softly. "Good. That means you're still human." Xander smiled. A rare occurrence lately. Then Victoria's tone changed. More serious. "Something interesting happened." "What?" "A reporter contacted my office." Xander frowned. "Which reporter?" "Ethan Walsh." The name meant nothing to him. Victoria continued. "He asked very specific questions." "What kind of questions?" "Questions about ownership." For the first time that week, Xander felt genuine curiosity. "That's unusual." "Very." Silence followed. Then, Victoria added something that caught his attention immediately. I think somebody outside this case is starting to notice the cracks." Xander looked out his window toward the darkening Columbus skyline. The campaign against him was still growing. The comments continued. The interviews continued. The assumptions continued. But now, somewhere beyond the noise, someone had started asking questions. Real questions. Questions based on documents. Questions based on facts. And facts had a way of surviving long after public opinion changed. The email had been sitting in an archive folder for almost 6 years, forgotten, ignored, buried beneath thousands of routine messages. Yet, by the following Monday morning, it had become the most important document in Victoria Hayes's office. She printed 3 copies, one for herself, one for Xander, one for the litigation binder that was growing thicker every day. Outside her office window, downtown Columbus moved through another ordinary work week. Inside, the divorce case was becoming anything but ordinary. Victoria sat at the conference table reviewing the email again. Not because she needed to, because experienced attorneys developed a habit of testing evidence repeatedly, looking for weaknesses, looking for alternative interpretations, looking for explanations opposing counsel might use. The email survived every test. Its language was clear. Its origin was verified. Its timestamp was authentic. Most importantly, it contradicted Brooke's public narrative. At 9:30, Xander arrived. He carried a notebook, a cup of black coffee, and the same composed expression he had worn since the divorce began. Victoria handed him the latest printout. "Read it again." He did, slowly, carefully. The message had been sent from Brooke's personal email account to a senior relationship manager at Huntington Bank. The subject line remained simple questions regarding property ownership structure. The body was even simpler. Brooke asked whether assets held by Hamilton Crest Holdings could eventually be transferred into personal ownership. She specifically mentioned the Michigan Lake House. She specifically referred to the property as company-owned, not family-owned, not marital property, company-owned. The distinction mattered a great deal. Xander finished reading and placed the paper down. "Still looks bad for her." Victoria nodded. "It gets worse." She opened another folder. A second email appeared, then a third. Xander leaned forward. These were new. He hadn't seen them before. Victoria pointed toward the dates. "Look at the timeline." The first email came from 6 years earlier, the second from 5 years earlier, the third from 4 years earlier. Each involved some variation of the same topic: ownership, transfers, asset structures, corporate holdings. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Brooke hadn't merely encountered the information once, she had discussed it repeatedly, over multiple years, with multiple professionals. One message caught Xander's attention immediately. It involved the Michigan property. Brooke had written, "If the lake house remains inside Hamilton Crest Holdings, does that affect inheritance rights or future transfer options?" He stared at the sentence, then looked up. She knew. Victoria folded her hands. "Yes." Not an assumption, not a theory, evidence, written evidence, the strongest kind. Unlike memories, emails didn't evolve. Unlike testimony, emails didn't become emotional. They simply existed, frozen in time. The room remained quiet. Finally, Xander spoke. "How did we miss these before?" Victoria smiled faintly. "We weren't looking for them." That was true. Divorce cases generated enormous amounts of paperwork. Most documents proved irrelevant. Sometimes the critical evidence hid among the least remarkable records. This appeared to be one of those situations. Victoria closed the folder. "There's another reason these matter." "What reason?" "They establish knowledge." Knowledge. One of the most important concepts in litigation. A person could misunderstand something, forget something, misremember something, But once repeated evidence demonstrated awareness, those explanations became harder to maintain. Brooks' public statements suggested confusion. The emails suggested familiarity. The gap between those positions continued growing. At 11 o'clock, Victoria joined a conference call with Melissa Grant, corporate counsel for Hamilton Crest Holdings. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Xander listened quietly. Melissa sounded increasingly concerned, not about the divorce itself, about the broader implications. The social media exposure is continuing. Victoria nodded. We know. Several clients have contacted us. Anything serious? Not yet. Melissa paused. But perception creates risk. There was that word again, perception. The invisible force driving the entire conflict. Melissa continued. We've identified another issue. Victoria immediately reached for a pen. What issue? The lake house. That got everyone's attention, Melissa explained. Since Brooks' Facebook post, several online accounts had reposted photographs of the Michigan property. One account even listed its approximate location. Not exact, but close enough. The problem wasn't privacy. The problem was security. Hamilton Crest Holdings owned the property. Employees used it occasionally. Corporate guests visited. Confidential meetings sometimes occurred there. Public exposure created complications. Nothing disastrous, just unnecessary. Melissa sounded irritated, not emotional, professional irritation. The kind generated when avoidable problems become real. We're documenting everything, Victoria approved. Good. The call ended shortly afterward. Xander sat quietly for a moment, then asked a question. What happens if this keeps escalating? Victoria considered the answer carefully. That depends. On what? Whether Brooks stops. He already knew the answer. She wouldn't, not yet. The attention remained too rewarding. The support remained too visible. The audience remained too large. People rarely abandoned a spotlight voluntarily, especially when they believed they were winning. Later that afternoon, another development arrived. Unexpected. Victoria received an email from journalist Ethan Walsh. The subject line contained only 6 words. Request for comment and verification. Victoria opened it immediately. The message was professional, brief, specific. Unlike most reporters following the story, Ethan wasn't asking about accusations. He wasn't asking about emotions. He wasn't asking about marital drama. He was asking about ownership records, entity structures, property filings, public documentation. Victoria read the email twice, then forwarded it to Xander. Minutes later, his phone rang. Interesting, he asked. Very. Why? Because he's asking the right questions. That mattered. For weeks, most coverage focused on Brooks' narrative. Now, someone was examining the paperwork. The distinction could change everything. Victoria replied to Ethan cautiously. Professional, limited. No confidential information. No legal strategy. Just confirmation that public records existed and ownership structures could be independently verified. An hour later, Ethan responded. The second email contained a single sentence. Several records appear inconsistent with the public claims currently circulating. Victoria smiled. That sentence alone told her something important. The reporter had done real research, not superficial research, real research. The dangerous kind. Dangerous for people telling incomplete stories. Meanwhile, across Columbus, Brooke continued moving forward. New interviews, new social media posts, new discussions. The campaign remained active. Yet cracks were beginning to form. Small cracks, invisible to most observers, but visible to people who examined evidence, visible to attorneys, visible to journalists, visible to anyone willing to read beyond headlines. That evening, Xander drove home through Upper Arlington. The neighborhood looked unchanged. Children played basketball in driveways. Dogs barked behind fences. Sprinklers watered lawns. Normal life continued. He pulled into the driveway of the house at the center of so much discussion, the house Brooke repeatedly described as hers. The house commenters believed belonged to him. The house reporters referenced. The house influencers discussed. The house that legally belonged to neither spouse. Only Hamilton Crest Holdings. The irony wasn't lost on him. A spotlight now illuminated assets people barely understood, and the brighter that spotlight became, the easier it became to see the truth. Inside the house, he reviewed the latest case notes, emails, property records, discovery requests, court schedules. The first major hearing was approaching, less than 3 weeks away. For the first time, both sides would stand before a judge. Facts would matter. Documentation would matter. Evidence would matter. Public opinion would not. His phone vibrated. A message from Victoria, only 2 sentences. Preston Cole requested additional records today. A second message followed moments later. He finally found the emails. Xander stared at the screen, then slowly smiled. Not because someone was losing. Not because he enjoyed conflict, because reality had finally entered the room. And once reality appeared, it rarely left. The first court hearing took place on a gray Wednesday morning in Franklin County. Rain had fallen throughout the night. The sidewalks around the courthouse remained wet. Traffic moved slowly through downtown Columbus. News vans weren't parked outside. No television cameras waited on the courthouse steps. Despite the attention Brooke's social media campaign had generated, the legal system remained indifferent. Courts didn't operate on hashtags. Courts operated on records. At 8:12 a.m., Xander Hamilton entered the Franklin County Domestic Relations Court building through the east entrance. He wore a charcoal gray suit. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy. The same leather briefcase he had carried for years rested in his hand. Victoria Hayes walked beside him. Calm, prepared, focused. They passed through security and moved toward courtroom 4B. The hallway already contained several attorneys and litigants. Most ignored them. A few recognized them. 1 or 2 whispered. Xander paid no attention. He had learned something during the past month. Public curiosity burned brightly, then faded. Facts lasted longer. At the far end of the corridor, Brooke appeared. She arrived surrounded by people. Her attorney, Preston Cole. A legal assistant, 2 friends. And Tyler Benson, the public relations consultant who had helped amplify her story. Brooke looked polished, carefully dressed, confident. The image matched the narrative she had spent weeks creating online. Several people in the hallway glanced toward her. Some recognized her immediately. Social media had made sure of that. Xander observed the scene quietly. The attention seemed intentional. Every detail felt calculated. Everything except the courtroom itself. Because once the hearing began, appearances would stop mattering. At 8:55 a.m., the courtroom doors opened. Everyone entered. Judge Owen Bradford took the bench precisely at 9 o'clock. He was 61 years old, known throughout Franklin County for patience and preparation. Attorneys respected him because he disliked theatrics. He preferred facts. That made him dangerous for anyone relying on performance. The clerk completed the opening formalities. Then the hearing began. Victoria sat beside Xander. Across the aisle, Brooke sat next to Preston. Judge Bradford reviewed several documents before speaking. This hearing concerns temporary orders and financial disclosures related to the pending dissolution. His voice was steady, professional, almost monotone. Exactly the kind of voice that reminded people this wasn't entertainment. This was law. Preston Cole stood first. Confident, well-spoken, experienced. He moved to the center podium. "Your Honor, we believe substantial assets may be subject to division in this matter." Judge Bradford nodded. "Proceed." For the next 15 minutes, Preston presented Brooks' position. Carefully, strategically, he avoided dramatic accusations, avoided emotional language, focused instead on access, control, use, lifestyle. The argument sounded reasonable. The Hamiltons had lived in an expensive home, used valuable properties, maintained significant financial resources. Therefore, Brooke argued those assets should be examined thoroughly. At first glance, the presentation appeared effective. Several observers in the gallery seemed persuaded. Even Xander acknowledged that Preston was skilled. The attorney knew how to strategically. He avoided dramatic accusations, avoided emotional language, focused instead on access, control, use, lifestyle. The argument sounded reasonable. The Hamiltons had lived in an expensive home, used valuable properties, maintained significant financial resources. Therefore, Brooke argued those assets should be examined thoroughly. At first glance, the presentation appeared effective. Several observers in the gallery seemed persuaded. Even Xander acknowledged that Preston was skilled. The attorney knew how to construct a narrative. Then came the request. Preston cleared his throat. "We respectfully request a temporary freeze on all potentially divisible assets pending full review." The courtroom became very quiet. A freeze. That was the objective. Not ownership, not division. Yet, control. If granted, the order could complicate operations connected to Hamilton Crest Holdings. Victoria remained completely still. Xander noticed. She had expected this. Judge Bradford looked down at the paperwork, then back up. "What evidence supports the request?" Preston referenced property lists, financial disclosures, publicly known holdings. The judge listened carefully, taking notes, asking occasional questions. Nothing unusual, nothing revealing. Then he turned toward Victoria. "Miss Hayes." Victoria stood. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice, no visible frustration. She carried a thin folder to the podium. Remarkably thin. Especially compared to the stack Preston had used, Judge Bradford noticed. "So, your response is contained in that file?" Victoria smiled slightly. "Yes, Your Honor." Several people glanced toward one another. The contrast was obvious. One side had presented volumes. The other carried a folder barely half an inch thick. Victoria opened it, then began. "Your Honor, before discussing division, we must first discuss ownership." The courtroom remained silent. Judge Bradford nodded. "Go ahead." Victoria placed the first document before the judge. A property deed. Upper Arlington residence. Judge Bradford reviewed it, then looked again. His expression did not change, but he spent longer on the page than before. Victoria continued, "The residence referenced repeatedly in these proceedings is owned by Hamilton Crest Holdings, LLC. She paused. "Not Mr. Hamilton." Another document appeared. Michigan Lake property, same ownership. Another, commercial real estate, same ownership. Another, investment reserves, corporate ownership. The pattern emerged quickly. Judge Bradford leaned back slightly. Now he was paying closer attention. So was Preston. Victoria continued methodically. No speeches, no attacks, just records. Every document connected to the same conclusion. Hamilton Crest Holdings existed as an independent legal entity, created before the marriage, maintained before the marriage, maintained throughout the marriage. Judge Bradford reviewed several pages in silence, then asked the question Victoria had been waiting for. "When was this entity established?" 14 years ago, Your Honor." The marriage had lasted 11. The timing mattered a great deal. Judge Bradford made another note, then another. Across the aisle, Preston's expression changed. Only slightly. But Xander noticed. The attorney had seen the problem. Maybe not all of it, enough of it. Victoria continued. The issue before the court is not whether my client used these assets. She paused. The issue is whether he owns them. The distinction landed. Cleanly, effectively. Judge Bradford looked towards Preston. Do you dispute these ownership records? Preston hesitated. Not long. Just long enough. No, Your Honor. That answer changed the atmosphere immediately, because ownership records weren't opinions. They weren't allegations. They were objective facts. Facts that now existed in the official record. The judge flipped through additional documents, then stopped. One page held his attention longer than the others. He looked toward Victoria. What is this? Victoria recognized the document instantly. Corporate formation paperwork, Hamilton Crest Holdings. Filed years before the marriage. She explained briefly. Judge Bradford nodded, then turned toward Preston again. Another question followed. Simple, direct, potentially devastating. Counselor, if the assets in question belong to a separate legal entity established before the marriage, on what basis are you requesting a blanket freeze? For the first time all morning, Preston appeared uncomfortable. Not defeated, not panicked, just cautious. The question forced him into difficult territory. Judge Bradford was no longer discussing appearances. He was discussing legal ownership. The hearing paused briefly while Preston formulated a response. Xander sat quietly, watching, listening, not celebrating, not reacting, just observing. Because this wasn't the victory. Not yet. This was merely the beginning. The first moment when assumptions encountered documentation. The first moment when public narratives met legal records. The first moment when the structure Brooke had ignored for years entered the conversation. Judge Bradford eventually moved the hearing forward. No ruling yet. No conclusions. More review would be required. Additional disclosures would follow. Further hearings would be scheduled. But something important had already happened. The foundation of Brooke's argument had been tested, and cracks had appeared. As attorneys gathered documents at the conclusion of the hearing, Victoria quietly returned to her seat. She organized her papers calmly, then leaned toward Xander. Did you see it? What? The judge. Xander nodded. He had. Judge Bradford wasn't interested in social media, wasn't interested in podcasts, wasn't interested in public opinion. He was interested in ownership, and ownership was exactly where Brooke's story became vulnerable. Across the courtroom, Preston gathered his own files. His expression remained professional. But one thing was clear. The next phase of the case would be very different from the first. Because now, everyone understood the same thing. The documents Brooke had posted online were no longer helping her. They were forcing people to ask questions, and some of those questions were becoming very difficult to answer. The morning after the hearing, the tone of the case changed. Not publicly. Online, the arguments continued. Comment sections remained active. Social media accounts kept reposting old screenshots. Supporters of Brooke still repeated the same claims. From the outside, nothing appeared different. Inside the legal process, however, the landscape had shifted. For the first time, the discussion was no longer centered on what people believed. It was centered on what could be proven. Xander noticed the change immediately. His phone no longer filled with links to opinion pieces. Instead, Victoria's emails contained requests. Document requests, ownership requests, corporate records requests, questions. Lots of questions. That was a good sign. Questions meant people were looking at evidence, and evidence was where Hamilton Crest Holdings had always been strongest. 3 days after the hearing, Victoria invited Xander back to her office. A fresh stack of documents waited on the conference table. This time, the pile was considerably larger. Preston Cole had responded. Victoria handed over a folder. "Read page 4. Xander opened it. The document summarized Brooks' latest position. The language was noticeably different. Gone were the broad accusations. Gone were the sweeping assumptions. Gone were the claims that everything belonged directly to him. Instead, the filing focused on control. Access, use, benefit, subtle difference, very important difference. Preston had adapted. An experienced attorney always did. Victoria sat across from him. "He knows ownership is a losing argument." Xander nodded. "I figured. Now he's trying a different path." "What path?" Victoria pointed toward the filing. "He wants to argue that even if the assets belong to Hamilton Crest Holdings, they effectively functioned as marital assets." Xander considered that. Not unreasonable, not impossible, but difficult, especially with documentation already in place. The discussion lasted nearly an hour. Every property was reviewed, every account, every disclosure, every ownership record. The deeper they went, the more obvious the pattern became. Hamilton Crest Holdings wasn't a shell. It wasn't a hidden account. It wasn't an improvised legal structure created during the marriage. It was an active company, a real company, operating long before Brooke entered Xander's life, paying taxes, maintaining records, holding meetings, managing assets, employing professionals. The distinction mattered enormously. At noon, Victoria opened another folder. Inside sat copies of Brooke's Facebook posts, every version, every update, every edit. Xander raised an eyebrow. "Why are we reviewing these again?" Victoria smiled slightly. "Because they just became evidence." That sentence changed everything, officially, formally. The social media posts had entered the litigation file, not as gossip, not as commentary, as evidence. The process had started when Victoria hired a digital forensic specialist. Every post had been preserved, every comment archived, every timestamp authenticated. Nothing could be deleted now. Not really. The internet rarely forgot. Court records forgot even less. Victoria slid several pages forward. "Look at these." Xander did. Highlighted comments, highlighted captions, highlighted statements. Most came directly from Brooke's original post. The wording seemed familiar. Then he noticed the problem. Several statements directly contradicted documented facts, not dramatic contradictions, specific contradictions. Ownership descriptions, dates, property classifications. The details people usually ignored. Unfortunately for Brooke, courts often cared most about details. Victoria tapped one section. She referred to the Upper Arlington property as jointly owned. Xander nodded. "It isn't." "Correct. Another section." She described the lake house as marital property. "It isn't." Another. She implied Hamilton Crest Holdings was created during the marriage. Xander looked up. "That's completely false." Victoria nodded. "Exactly." The significance wasn't that Brooke was wrong. People could be mistaken. The significance was that she had repeatedly published statements despite having signed disclosures acknowledging otherwise. That made the issue more serious. Not necessarily fatal, but serious. Later that afternoon, another development arrived. Unexpected, yet important. Journalist Ethan Walsh published his first article. The headline appeared on a regional news website. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't sensational, it simply asked a question. Who actually owns the assets in the Hamilton divorce case? The article spread quickly, not because it was emotional, because it was factual. Ethan reviewed public records, property deeds, corporate filings, business registrations, everything publicly available. The article reached a cautious conclusion. The ownership structure described in public records appeared more complex than social media discussions suggested. That single sentence created immediate consequences. For weeks, one narrative had dominated. Now, another perspective existed. A documented perspective. The reaction online was immediate. Some readers ignored it. Some dismissed it. Others became curious. Curiosity mattered. Curiosity led people toward records. Records led people toward facts, and facts increasingly favored Xander. Victoria forwarded the article to him. No message attached, just the link. Xander read it carefully, then read it again. The article didn't defend him, didn't attack Brooke, didn't choose sides. It simply presented information. That alone felt refreshing. When he finished, he set the phone aside. For the first time in weeks, someone outside the legal team was examining the situation objectively. That mattered more than most people realized. Meanwhile, Preston Cole faced growing challenges. Not because he lacked skill, because facts limited available arguments. Several days later, another discovery conference took place. This one occurred privately. No public audience, no observers, just attorneys exchanging information. Victoria arrived prepared. Boxes of records, corporate documents, ownership ledgers, acquisition histories. Everything organized, everything verified. Preston reviewed the materials throughout the day. The more he reviewed, the quieter he became. By evening, Victoria understood something important. Preston no longer seemed focused on proving ownership. He appeared focused on damage control. That shift mattered a lot, because attorneys rarely abandoned strong arguments, only weak ones. When Victoria returned home that night, she called Xander. "I think we're seeing the first crack." Xander leaned back in his chair. The first crack. In their case. Silence followed. Then he asked the obvious question. How serious? Victoria considered it carefully. Serious enough that Preston is changing strategies. That answer told him everything. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. The city lights reflected across wet streets. Columbus looked peaceful. The divorce case did not. For weeks, Brooke's campaign had relied on a simple assumption. That public perception would become reality. That repetition would become proof. That attention would become leverage. The problem was that legal systems operated differently. Judges reviewed records. Attorneys examined documents. Evidence accumulated. And once evidence began accumulating, narratives became harder to maintain. Before ending the call, Victoria mentioned one final development. Something new, something potentially important. The forensic team finished reviewing the Facebook post. Xander immediately paid attention. And they identified every version. Okay? They also identified edits. His expression changed slightly. What kind of edits? Victoria paused. Long enough to create tension. Long enough to signal significance. When Brooke first uploaded the post, the wording was different. Xander sat upright. Different how? We're still analyzing it. Anything important? Another pause. Then Victoria answered. Potentially very important. The line went quiet. Outside, rain continued falling across Columbus. Inside, Xander stared at the city lights beyond the window. The ownership argument was weakening. The documentation continued growing. The public narrative was starting to fracture. And now there was a new question. A question nobody had considered before. Not what Brooke posted, but what she changed afterward. And why? The first measurable damage appeared on a Tuesday morning. Not in court, not online, not in the media. It appeared inside an email. At 8:17 a.m., Melissa Grant received a message from one of Hamilton Crest Holdings' long-term commercial clients, a medical distribution company based in Cincinnati. The relationship had existed for nearly 7 years. The account generated significant annual revenue. The message was professional, polite, carefully worded. That made it worse. Melissa forwarded the email to Xander and Victoria immediately. The client wasn't terminating the relationship, not yet, but they were suspending negotiations on a pending contract expansion. Reason: recent public allegations involving ownership and financial transparency. Xander read the email twice, then set it down. The reaction felt predictable, unpleasant, but predictable. Businesses avoided uncertainty, even temporary uncertainty, especially when millions of dollars were involved. 30 minutes later, another email arrived, then another. Not cancellations, questions, clarifications, requests for documentation. The pattern continued throughout the day. Hamilton Crest Holdings wasn't losing clients, but it was spending time defending itself against concerns created by Brooks' public campaign. That distinction mattered. The company wasn't suffering because of proven wrongdoing. It was suffering because of perception, and perception unfortunately carried a cost. That afternoon, Melissa, Victoria, and Xander met at the company's Delaware County office. The mood remained professional, focused, less emotional than most people might expect. No one raised their voice. No one blamed Brooke directly. The discussion centered on facts: revenue exposure, client concerns, potential reputational harm. Melissa placed a spreadsheet on the conference table. The numbers are still manageable. Xander reviewed the report. How manageable? We've identified approximately $380,000 in delayed opportunities. Not lost, delayed, important difference, still significant, Melissa continued. 2 clients requested additional compliance reviews. Another page appeared. 3 vendors asked for ownership clarification. Another. And 1 banking partner requested updated corporate documentation. Xander leaned back. The issue was becoming clearer. The damage wasn't dramatic, it was cumulative. Small interruptions, small delays, small doubts. The kind that slowly spread if left unaddressed. Victoria folded her hands. This changes things. Everyone looked toward her. Melissa nodded. I agree. Because until now, the divorce had remained largely personal. Now, corporate interests were becoming involved. That created new responsibilities, new obligations, and potentially new legal remedies. Victoria spoke carefully. Hamilton Crest Holdings has fiduciary responsibilities. Xander already understood. The company didn't exist solely for him. Employees depended on it. Partners depended on it. Business relationships depended on it. The situation was no longer simply about protecting his reputation. It was about protecting the company. That distinction mattered. A lot. For the next hour, they reviewed documentation. Emails, client inquiries, online posts, media mentions. Everything was organized into categories. Every potential consequence documented. Every timeline preserved. Melissa eventually closed her folder. I think we're reaching a point where formal action may be necessary. Victoria nodded slowly. Possibly. Neither attorney sounded eager. Lawsuits created costs, distractions, complications. But businesses also had obligations to defend themselves, especially when measurable harm emerged. Meanwhile, the online campaign continued. Brooke posted less frequently now. Yet, the original content remained active. Thousands of shares, thousands of comments, countless screenshots circulating across platforms. Even people who never followed the story directly continued reposting fragments. The internet rarely needed complete information, only interesting information. Several days later, another development occurred. One of Ethan Walsh's follow-up articles gained unexpected traction. This time, the headline was more direct. Public records raise questions about viral divorce claims. The article remained careful, professional, document-based. Ethan didn't accuse Brooke of lying. He simply compared public allegations against public records. Readers began noticing inconsistencies. More importantly, some reporters began noticing them too. For the first time, the media narrative showed signs of changing. Not dramatically, gradually. The shift resembled a tide, slow, subtle, difficult to stop once it began. Late Friday afternoon, Victoria called Xander. "I have an update." He immediately recognized the tone. Something important had happened. "What is it?" "The forensic review is complete." Xander sat upright. The Facebook post, the edits, the changes, all finally analyzed. "What did they find?" Victoria opened a report. Several pages long. Prepared by digital evidence specialists. The conclusions were straightforward. Brooke had modified the original post multiple times during the first 48 hours. Captions changed, descriptions changed, statements changed. Most edits appeared minor. One did not. Victoria turned to the relevant page. There. Xander scanned the highlighted section. His expression hardened slightly. Not anger, focus. The earliest version of the post contained language referencing Hamilton Crest Holdings directly. The wording acknowledged the company, acknowledged corporate ownership, acknowledged legal structures. Several hours later, those references disappeared, removed, edited out. The revised version shifted blame entirely toward Xander personally. Victoria allowed several seconds of silence, then asked, "Do you see the problem?" "Yes." Because the implication was obvious, the first version suggested Brooke understood the ownership distinction. The edited version suggested she wanted readers to overlook it. Intent, again. The case kept returning to intent. Not mistakes, not misunderstandings, choices. The report contained timestamps, version histories, archived screenshots, everything authenticated, everything admissible. Xander looked out the office window. The sun was setting over Columbus. Traffic crawled across distant highways. People headed home. Normal life continued. Meanwhile, another piece of evidence quietly entered the file. Another piece of evidence Brooke never expected to exist. The following week brought an even bigger development. Hamilton Crest Holdings formally documented business losses connected to the online campaign. Nothing exaggerated, nothing speculative, only measurable impacts. Delayed contracts, additional legal expenses, compliance reviews, client reassurance efforts. The report totaled dozens of pages. When Melissa completed the final calculations, she forwarded them to Victoria. Victoria reviewed the summary, then called Xander. "This is becoming real." It already felt real. Not like this. He understood, up to that point most consequences existed in theory. Now there were numbers, records, invoices, specific examples. Courts liked specifics. Specifics were difficult to argue with. Several days later, a procedural hearing addressed discovery matters. No major rulings occurred. Yet, something important happened. Judge Bradford reviewed portions of the social media evidence, not all of it, just enough. His reaction remained restrained, professional. But one question stood out. He looked towards Preston Cole. "Has your client preserved all social media records?" The courtroom became very quiet. Preston answered carefully. "To the best of our knowledge, yes." Judge Bradford nodded, then asked another question. "Has any content been modified or deleted?" A brief pause followed. Only a few seconds. Yet it felt longer. Preston glanced toward Brooke, then answered, "There have been edits." Judge Bradford wrote something down. No comment, no reaction, just a note. Xander noticed. Victoria noticed. Everyone noticed. Because experienced attorneys understood something simple. Judges often revealed very little. The questions they asked mattered more than the answers they received. After the hearing, Victoria and Xander walked through the courthouse corridor. People moved around them. Other cases, other disputes, other lives. Normal courthouse activity. Victoria stopped near the elevators, then spoke quietly. "I think we're approaching a turning point." Xander looked at her. "What kind of turning point?" "The point where this stops being about allegations." He waited. Victoria continued, "And starts being about evidence." The elevator doors opened, people stepped inside, the conversation ended. But the thought remained, because every week the same pattern repeated. Brooke's story generated attention. The evidence generated questions, and questions had a habit of leading somewhere unexpected, particularly when someone was trying very hard to control the narrative. The discovery order arrived on a Monday afternoon. Unlike social media posts, podcasts, or news articles, discovery carried legal weight. It was not a request. It was a process. Documents would be exchanged. Communications would be reviewed. Records would be preserved. And in many cases, people would discover that the internet never forgot nearly as much as they hoped. Victoria Hayes received the notice shortly after lunch. She called Xander immediately. "We got it." Xander already knew what she meant. Discovery, the next major phase. The phase where stories met records. The phase where assumptions met documentation. And often the phase where cases changed direction. "How broad?" he asked. "Broader than I expected." That caught his attention. Victoria continued. "The court approved social media communications. All of them. Relevant communications. That was enough. Because Brooke's online campaign had touched almost every part of the case. The Facebook post. The podcast appearances. Private coordination efforts. Media outreach. Public commentary. Everything suddenly became important. For the next 2 weeks, digital forensic specialists worked through massive amounts of material. Messages, emails, direct messages, archived posts, metadata, version histories, thousands of pages. Most of it proved irrelevant. Some of it did not. One Friday morning, Victoria invited Xander to her office. When he entered, she was already waiting. A thick binder sat on the conference table. Several sections had yellow tabs. Never a good sign, or a very good sign, depending on perspective. Victoria slid the binder toward him. "We found communications with Tyler Benson." Xander opened the first section. Printed text messages. Dozens of pages. Conversations between Brooke and the public relations consultant who had helped shape her public narrative. At first, the messages seemed ordinary. Discussions about interviews, timing, audience engagement, media opportunities. Then the tone changed. One exchange stood out immediately. Tyler had written, "You need people focused on him, not the company." Brooke responded, "That's exactly what I'm trying to do." Xander read the exchange twice, then continued. More messages followed. More strategy, more planning. One message from Tyler suggested emphasizing personal betrayal. Another recommended simplifying complex ownership issues. Another discussed how audiences reacted more strongly to emotional narratives than financial structures. None of it was illegal. But it painted a picture, a very specific picture. The campaign had not evolved naturally. It had been managed, deliberately, carefully, strategically. Victoria pointed toward another section. "Keep reading." Xander turned the page. The next messages were more troubling. Tyler asked whether references to Hamilton Crest Holdings should remain in public posts. Brooks' answer arrived 3 minutes later. No, most people won't understand it. Another message followed. If they focus on the company, they'll miss the point. Then another. The story works better if everything points back to Xander. The room became quiet. Victoria watched him. He showed little reaction, but she knew him well enough to recognize concentration. Not anger, analysis. The messages continued. Then came the statement that changed everything. A statement buried halfway through a conversation dated 2 weeks after the original Facebook post. Tyler had written, "Can anyone prove you knew those assets weren't in his name?" Brooks' response appeared less than a minute later. "Not unless they start digging through old records." For several seconds, nobody spoke. The words sat on the page. Simple, direct, damaging. Victoria finally broke the silence. "That one matters." Xander nodded slowly. Yes, it mattered, a great deal. Not because it proved wrongdoing, because it demonstrated awareness. Again, the case kept returning to the same issue. Knowledge, understanding, intent, the very areas Brooke had tried hardest to avoid. Victoria opened another folder. "There's more." Xander almost laughed. There always was. Discovery rarely ended with one surprise. The next section involved private group messages, several participants, mostly friends. One name appeared repeatedly. Natalie Brooks. Brooks' closest friend. Someone who had attended countless social events with the couple over the years. Natalie wasn't hostile, wasn't particularly involved, but she had witnessed conversations, and witnesses mattered, especially neutral witnesses. Victoria handed over several printed messages. Brooke had discussed the divorce extensively within the group. At first, the conversations sounded emotional. Frustration, disappointment, anger. Then practical matters emerged. Asset discussions, property discussions, ownership discussions. One message immediately caught Xander's attention. Natalie had written, "I thought those properties belonged to the holding company." Brooks' response appeared seconds later. "I know, but everyone thinks they're ours." The sentence sat there, frozen, permanent, undeniable. No context helped, no interpretation improved it. The meaning remained obvious. Brooke knew, Natalie knew. At least at some point everyone involved understood the distinction. Victoria closed the folder. That statement alone could become very important. Xander agreed. Not because it proved malice, because it contradicted months of public messaging. Contradictions accumulated. One contradiction could be explained. 10 became harder. 20 became impossible. The afternoon continued. Page after page. Message after message. By evening, a clearer picture had emerged. The public campaign wasn't simply emotional. It had been curated, refined, adjusted, optimized. Most importantly, certain details had been intentionally minimized, particularly ownership details, particularly Hamilton Crest Holdings. That realization carried consequences, not just legally, strategically, because Brooks' credibility was becoming increasingly vulnerable. The following week, another development arrived. Unexpected. Natalie Brooks received a subpoena. Not because anyone wanted to attack her, because she possessed relevant information. The reaction surprised everyone, especially Brooke. Within 48 hours, Natalie's attorney contacted both parties. The message was straightforward. Natalie intended to cooperate. That mattered very much. Cooperative witnesses often proved difficult to control. Several days later, Victoria attended Natalie's deposition. Xander did not. He preferred not to. Depositions rarely benefited from emotional investment. Victoria handled those matters better. The deposition lasted nearly 5 hours. When it ended, Victoria called immediately. Her voice sounded tired, but satisfied. "How did it go?" Xander asked. A pause followed. Then, "Better than expected." "What happened?" Victoria took a breath. Natalie was honest. That answer alone spoke volumes. Honest witnesses were powerful, particularly when they lacked obvious motivations. Victoria continued. Natalie confirmed several conversations about ownership, among other things. More silence. Then Victoria added, "She confirmed Brooke understood the holding company structure years ago." Xander looked out his office window. The late afternoon sun reflected off nearby buildings. Traffic moved through downtown Columbus. Life continued normally. Yet another piece of the case had shifted. Another layer had cracked. Another assumption had failed. Victoria wasn't finished. There was one more thing. "What?" A brief pause. Then she answered. Natalie remembered a conversation from the lake house. Xander waited. Brooke joked that everything belonged to the company except the furniture. His eyes narrowed slightly, not because the joke was funny, because of what it implied. Awareness, again. The same issue, always the same issue, knowledge, understanding, intent. By the time the call ended, dusk had settled across Columbus. Office lights illuminated the skyline. The city glowed beneath gathering clouds. Xander remained at his desk, reviewing notes, reviewing timelines, reviewing evidence. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. Emails, messages, witnesses, disclosures. Each pointed in the same direction. Each reinforced the others. And the stronger that pattern became, the weaker Brooke's public narrative appeared. His phone buzzed. A message from Victoria. Only one sentence. Short, simple, yet somehow more significant than everything else that day. "We just found a message she forgot to delete." Xander stared at the screen, then read it again. The case already contained enough evidence to create problems. If there was something worse still hidden inside the records, the next phase could change everything. The message Brooke forgot to delete surfaced on a rainy Thursday morning. Victoria Hayes received it from the forensic review team shortly before 8:00 a.m. The recovery process had taken weeks. Most deleted messages remained inaccessible. Some did not. Technology had become remarkably effective at preserving information people believed was gone forever. Victoria read the recovered message once, then again. Then she called Xander. "Can you come in?" He immediately recognized the tone. Something significant had happened. 40 minutes later, he arrived at her office. The rain continued outside. Downtown Columbus disappeared behind low gray clouds. Victoria was already waiting. A printed copy rested on the conference table. No dramatic introduction. No build-up. She simply handed him the page. "Read it." Xander sat down and did exactly that. The message was part of an exchange between Brooke and Tyler Benson. The conversation occurred 3 days before the original Facebook post. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Discussion about timing, audience engagement, media exposure. Then the conversation changed direction. Tyler asked whether posting court documents was a good idea. Brooke responded immediately. "Once people see the list, they'll assume everything belongs to him." Xander continued reading. Another message followed. "I don't need them to understand the structure." Then another. "I just need them angry." The room became very quiet. Victoria allowed several seconds to pass. Then she spoke. "This is the strongest message we've found." Xander looked down again. The wording wasn't subtle, didn't require interpretation, didn't depend on context. The intent appeared obvious. Not necessarily fraudulent, but strategic. Very strategic. and unfortunately for Brooke, courts tended to notice strategy when it involved public campaigns. Victoria folded her hands. Combined with everything else, this creates a pattern. The word pattern had become increasingly important. One email could be explained, one statement could be misunderstood, one comment could be emotional. Patterns were harder. Patterns suggested consistency, intent, purpose, direction, and the pattern surrounding Brooke was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The timing of the discovery could not have been worse for her, or better for Xander, because another development was occurring simultaneously: settlement discussions. Preston Cole had finally reached out. The first formal proposal arrived 2 days later. Victoria reviewed it carefully before forwarding it to Xander. The offer occupied 6 pages. Most of the language remained standard, professional, predictable. Then came the financial terms. The request surprised nobody, yet the scale surprised everyone. Brooke wanted the Upper Arlington house, the Michigan Lake property, $2 million in cash compensation, additional support payments, and an agreement preventing future claims regarding her public statements. Victoria stared at the proposal for nearly a minute, then laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was impossible. When Xander arrived later that afternoon, she slid the document across the table. He read quietly. Finished. Then looked up. "Does Preston actually think I can agree to this?" Victoria shook her head. "No." "Then why send it?" "Because I don't think this offer was written for legal reasons." That answer intrigued him. "What reasons?" Victoria tapped the document. "I think it's written for leverage." That made more sense. Settlement proposals often revealed priorities. This proposal revealed something obvious. Brooke still believed the assets were within reach, or at least wanted everyone to believe they were. The problem remained unchanged. Most of the requested assets did not belong to Xander. They belonged to Hamilton Crest Holdings. Victoria opened another folder. "There's something else." Xander almost smiled. There was always something else. Melissa Grant and corporate counsel had completed their latest review. The results were not encouraging for Brooke. Hamilton Crest Holdings had now documented additional costs directly linked to the public campaign. Legal expenses, public relations expenses, compliance reviews, client reassurance efforts, operational disruptions. The number exceeded $600,000. Not all recoverable, not all permanent, but substantial. Victoria leaned forward. "The company is considering formal action." Xander understood immediately. Not out of revenge, out of obligation. Businesses had responsibilities. Ignoring measurable harm wasn't always an option, especially when shareholders, employees, and partners became affected. He sat quietly, then asked the obvious question. "Would they win?" Victoria answered honestly. "I don't know." A pause. "But they have arguments, strong arguments, potentially expensive arguments." The distinction mattered. Across town, Brooke faced growing problems of her own. Several media outlets that previously supported her story had begun changing tone. Not attacking, questioning. The shift remained subtle, but it existed. One article referenced public ownership records. Another mentioned inconsistencies between social media claims and court filings. Another cited Ethan Walsh's reporting. The narrative was no longer unified. That created danger. Public support often depended on certainty. Questions weakened certainty, questions created doubt, and doubt spread quickly. The following week brought another hearing, smaller than the previous one, focused primarily on discovery and procedural matters. Yet, one exchange changed the atmosphere dramatically. Judge Bradford reviewed portions of the latest evidence, including the recovered messages. Not all of them. Enough. The courtroom remained quiet as the judge flipped through several pages. Then he looked toward Preston Cole. "Has settlement been discussed?" Preston nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Bradford glanced at another document, then another. Finally, he spoke again. "The court strongly encourages realistic expectations." The statement sounded harmless, routine, almost boring. Experienced attorneys knew better. Judges chose words carefully, especially during active litigation. Realistic expectations. The phrase lingered long after the hearing ended. Outside the courtroom, Victoria walked beside Xander toward the elevators. Neither spoke initially. Finally, Xander broke the silence. "That sounded intentional?" Victoria nodded. "It was." "How bad?" "Bad enough that he wanted it on the record." The elevator doors opened. People entered, people exited. The courthouse continued functioning normally. Meanwhile, both sides understood something important. The judge had begun forming opinions. Not final opinions, not rulings, impressions. Impressions mattered, especially when built upon evidence. Later that evening, Victoria received another call. This one from Melissa Grant. The conversation lasted nearly 30 minutes. When it ended, Victoria immediately contacted Xander. The company made a decision. What decision? They approved preparation for a countersuit. The words hung in the air. Not filed, not yet, prepared. A significant distinction. Still serious, very serious. Xander stood near the window of his home office. The city lights glowed in the distance. Traffic moved along the highway. Rain tapped softly against the glass. "What triggers it?" he asked. Melissa's answer had been simple. Continued damages, continued misinformation, continued interference. If those conditions persisted, Hamilton Crest Holdings would likely move forward. Not because of the divorce, because of the business consequences. The distinction remained critical. After the call ended, Xander stayed by the window for several minutes, thinking. Not about winning, not about revenge, not even about Brooke. He thought about consequences. Small decisions, small assumptions, small moments. The original Facebook post had probably felt harmless. One upload, a few screenshots, a little public pressure, nothing more. Yet, that single decision had triggered a chain reaction. Media coverage, corporate scrutiny, discovery, witnesses, recovered messages, potential litigation. And now a possible countersuit from a company Brooke had spent months pretending didn't matter. His phone vibrated one final time before midnight. A message from Victoria. Short, direct, the way she preferred. Preston requested another settlement meeting. Xander stared at the screen, then slowly set the phone down, because for the first time since the divorce began, the requests were no longer getting larger. They were getting smaller, and that usually meant one thing. Someone had finally started recognizing the danger. The final hearing began at 9:00 a.m. on a cold Monday morning in Franklin County. Unlike the earlier proceedings, everyone understood the significance of this one. Months of discovery, thousands of pages of documents, dozens of depositions, financial records, corporate records, social media evidence, everything had led to this moment. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Not national media, not major television networks, local journalists, regional business reporters, a few independent writers. Enough to create attention. Not enough to create spectacle. Exactly the kind of environment Judge Owen Bradford preferred. Inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere felt different. More focused, more serious, less emotional. The excitement surrounding Brooke's original allegations had faded. What remained were records, and records rarely generated excitement. They generated conclusions. Xander arrived early. As usual, dark suit, simple tie, no entourage, no public statements, no interviews. He sat beside Victoria Hayes and reviewed the hearing binder one final time. Not because he needed to memorize anything, because preparation had become routine. Across the room, Brooke sat with Preston Cole. The confidence that had surrounded her during the first hearing seemed diminished. Not gone, just different. The months between hearings had been difficult. The social media momentum had slowed. Several articles had questioned her claims. Witness testimony had complicated her narrative. Discovery had revealed more than anyone expected. The reality of litigation had replaced the excitement of publicity. At exactly 9 o'clock, Judge Bradford entered. The room stood, then sat. The hearing began. Victoria was first, not because she demanded it, because the evidence timeline made more sense that way. She walked to the podium carrying a single binder. No dramatic gestures, no theatrical pauses, just documents. The same approach she had used since the beginning. The first exhibit appeared on the courtroom screen. The prenuptial disclosure package. Several pages. Several signatures. Judge Bradford had already seen portions of it. Now he saw the complete sequence. Victoria spoke calmly. "Your Honor, this document establishes knowledge." The word echoed softly through the courtroom. Knowledge, again, always knowledge. Every major issue in the case seemed to return to that concept. Victoria continued. The screen changed. Next came the formation records for Hamilton Crest Holdings, filed years before the marriage, operating years before the marriage, acquiring assets years before the marriage, dates, signatures, public filings, simple facts. Then came ownership records. Upper Arlington property, Michigan Lake House, commercial real estate investment reserves. Each document carried the same conclusion. The assets existed. The assets had value, but they were not personally owned by Xander Hamilton. The hearing continued. Methodical. Precise. One exhibit after another. No surprises, no ambushes. Everything had already been exchanged during discovery. The power came from accumulation. A single record meant little. 50 records meant something. 100 records meant even more. Victoria understood that. So did Judge Bradford. The next exhibit changed the atmosphere slightly. The email chain. The one Brooke had sent years earlier. Questions regarding ownership structures. Questions regarding transfers. Questions regarding company-held assets. Questions that demonstrated awareness. Victoria displayed the email, highlighted the relevant sections, then remained silent. No explanation necessary. The document spoke for itself. Judge Bradford reviewed it carefully, then made several notes. Across the room, Preston Cole watched without interruption. There was little else he could do. The document existed, the timestamp existed, the language existed. Facts rarely responded to argument. Next came the witness testimony, Natalie Brooks. Her deposition excerpts appeared on screen, statements regarding conversations, statements regarding the holding company, statements regarding Brooks' understanding of ownership structures. Again, the same pattern, the same issue, the same conclusion. Knowledge, understanding, awareness. The foundation beneath Brooks' public claims continued weakening. Victoria paused, then moved to the final section. The social media evidence, the courtroom became noticeably quieter. Even the reporters leaned forward slightly. Everyone understood this part mattered. The original Facebook post appeared on screen. Then another version. Then another. Side by side. Time-stamped, archived, verified. Judge Bradford studied them carefully. The differences were obvious. References to Hamilton Crest Holdings appeared in the earliest version. Those references disappeared later. Ownership distinctions vanished. Language shifted. Responsibility narrowed. Attention focused increasingly on Xander personally. Victoria spoke only briefly. The edits are documented. Then she stepped aside. No speech, no emotional appeal, just evidence. The hearing paused for several minutes. Judge Bradford reviewed the materials. Then Preston Cole approached the podium. To his credit, he did not attempt the impossible. He did not argue ownership. That battle had ended long ago. Instead, he focused on use, lifestyle, marital expectations, shared experiences. It was a reasonable strategy, perhaps the only remaining strategy. He argued that Brooke had built her life around assets she reasonably believed were available. He argued that perceptions inside a marriage mattered. He argued that emotional realities deserved consideration. The presentation was professional, measured, respectful. Judge Bradford listened attentively. Yet something remained different. The argument now occupied a much smaller space than before, because ownership had become established, and ownership shaped everything else. After lunch, testimony resumed. For the first time in the case, Xander took the stand. The courtroom watched closely. Months of public discussion had turned him into a character, a symbol, an assumption. Now, people would finally hear him speak. Victoria's questions were brief, deliberately brief. She understood something important. Long explanations often weakened strong cases. Simple answers strengthened them. Did you create Hamilton Crest Holdings during the marriage? No. Was the company operating before the marriage? Yes. Did Brooke receive ownership disclosures before marriage? Yes. Did she have independent legal counsel? Yes. The questions continued. Short, direct, precise. The answers remained the same. Calm, controlled, factual, no attacks, no insults, no bitterness. The observers seemed surprised by that. Perhaps they expected anger. Perhaps they expected revenge. Instead, they saw discipline. When Preston cross-examined him, the tone remained civil. Several questions focused on lifestyle. Several focused on access. Several focused on family expectations. Xander answered honestly. Yes, Brooke used the properties. Yes, they enjoyed the benefits. Yes, they traveled. Yes, they lived comfortably. Nothing controversial, nothing defensive, because none of those facts changed ownership. Eventually, the testimony ended. Xander stepped down. Victoria returned to counsel table. The hearing entered its final phase. Closing arguments. Shorter than most people expected. Judge Bradford had already reviewed the evidence, already reviewed the filings, already reviewed the testimony. Nobody needed speeches. Victoria summarized the case in less than 15 minutes. A timeline appeared on screen. Marriage, disclosures, corporate records, emails, social media posts, messages, depositions. Each piece connected logically to the next. No gaps, no dramatic leaps, just a sequence. A sequence that consistently pointed in the same direction. When she finished, the courtroom remained silent. Judge Bradford reviewed his notes. Several pages worth. Then looked up. His expression revealed little, as always. Yet his next words carried weight, significant weight. The court has concerns regarding the public dissemination of incomplete and potentially misleading information. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Judge Bradford continued, particularly where such dissemination appears inconsistent with documented knowledge. Victoria lowered her pen. Preston remained motionless. The reporters typed furiously. The statement wasn't a ruling. Not yet, but it was close. Very close. Judge Bradford announced that final orders would follow after review of the complete record. Then he adjourned the hearing. The gavel struck once. People began standing. gathering papers, leaving the courtroom. Yet one feeling lingered in the air. Not certainty, not quite. Something close. Because after months of noise, accusations, interviews, posts, and speculation, the case had finally been reduced to its simplest form. Documents. And documents had proven remarkably difficult to argue with. The final order arrived 23 days after the hearing. 23 days of waiting. 23 days of speculation. 23 days of online commentary from people who had no idea what the actual ruling would contain. For Xander Hamilton, the waiting period felt strangely peaceful. Not because he was confident, because there was nothing left to do. The documents had been submitted. The testimony had been completed. The evidence existed. Now, the decision belonged to Judge Owen Bradford, and unlike social media, judges worked quietly. On a cold Thursday morning, Victoria Hayes called. The moment Xander saw her name appear on his phone, he knew. The ruling had arrived. "Come to the office," she said. Her voice revealed nothing. No excitement, no disappointment, just professionalism. The drive from Upper Arlington to downtown Columbus took less than 20 minutes. Traffic remained light. The city looked ordinary. Coffee shops opened, office workers crossed intersections, delivery trucks unloaded shipments. Meanwhile, months of conflict were about to end. When Xander entered Victoria's conference room, 3 copies of the ruling sat neatly arranged on the table. One for Victoria, one for the firm's records, one for him. 47 pages. Judge Bradford had been thorough, very thorough. Victoria waited until he sat down. Then she spoke. The short version. Xander nodded. The court rejected most of Brooks' claims. Silence followed. Not because the outcome surprised him, because hearing the words made everything real. Victoria opened the document. Page after page contained findings. Analysis. References to exhibits. References to testimony. References to discovery materials. The judge had examined everything. The ownership issue appeared first. That made sense. It had become the foundation of the case. Judge Bradford's conclusion was direct. Hamilton Crest Holdings existed before the marriage. The company functioned as a legitimate independent entity. Its ownership structure had been documented repeatedly. Its assets were not marital property solely because the parties used them. The language was formal, legal, yet the meaning remained simple. The argument Brooke built her case around had failed. Victoria turned several pages. The court further finds, she paused briefly, that substantial evidence demonstrates prior knowledge of the ownership structure. Again. The same issue, knowledge, awareness, intent, the concepts that had haunted Brooks' position for months. The judge referenced emails, referenced disclosures, referenced testimony, referenced messages. All roads led to the same conclusion. Brooke knew, maybe not every detail, maybe not every technicality, but enough to undermine the claims she had made publicly. Xander listened quietly. His expression changed very little. Victoria noticed, most clients celebrated, most reacted emotionally, most wanted validation. Xander wanted accuracy, and accuracy had finally arrived. Several pages later, the ruling addressed property division. The Upper Arlington residence, not divisible. Michigan Lake property, not divisible. Commercial real estate, not divisible. Corporate investment reserves, not divisible. Everything flowed from ownership. Ownership determined outcomes. That reality remained unchanged regardless of public opinion. Brooke would still receive assets. The marriage had lasted more than a decade. There were legitimate marital interests, joint accounts, personal property, certain financial considerations. Judge Bradford recognized those realities. The ruling was not punitive. It was balanced, measured, grounded in documentation. exactly as courts were supposed to be. Victoria continued reading. Then she reached the section everyone had been waiting for, the social media section. The room became noticeably quieter. Even after months of litigation, this part still carried weight. Judge Bradford's language remained careful, yet unmistakable. The court found that the publication of divorce-related materials created unnecessary complications. The court found that portions of the public narrative conflicted with documented evidence. The court found that certain statements demonstrated poor judgment. Poor judgment, a mild phrase, perhaps intentionally mild. Judges rarely wrote for headlines. They wrote for records. Still, the meaning was clear. Brooks' online campaign had not helped her case. Quite the opposite. Victoria closed the document briefly, then looked toward Xander. "There is more." He nodded. Hamilton Crest Holdings. The company had filed separate requests regarding documented damages. Not a full trial, not yet, but enough to require judicial review. Judge Bradford declined to decide those issues within the divorce proceeding. Instead, he acknowledged the company's right to pursue independent remedies if it chose to do so. That single paragraph mattered enormously, because it left the door open. Melissa Grant had predicted exactly that. The company wasn't guaranteed success, but it had standing. Standing created options, and options created leverage. Xander stared at the ruling for several seconds, then asked the question that mattered least legally, yet perhaps most personally. "What happens to Brooke now?" Victoria considered the answer. Carefully. "Legally, yes. She moves on." A pause. "Like everyone else." That answer felt appropriate. This wasn't a movie. Nobody disappeared dramatically. Nobody lost everything. Nobody rode into the sunset. Life simply continued. Consequences existed. Then people lived with them. The ruling required Brooke to remove certain online materials, several posts, several public references, certain related content. The process would take time, but the order was clear. Additionally, portions of the legal expenses would be allocated against her. Not catastrophic amounts. Enough to matter. Enough to reflect the court's concerns. The remainder of the afternoon passed quietly. Phone calls, notifications, attorney discussions, administrative tasks. The legal world moved quickly once decisions became final. By evening, reporters had obtained copies of the ruling. Articles appeared almost immediately. Most headlines sounded far different from those published months earlier. One focused on ownership. Another focused on corporate structures. Another highlighted the court's findings regarding prior knowledge. The story had changed. Not because anyone controlled the narrative, because evidence eventually caught up to it. Later that night, Xander sat alone on the back patio of the Upper Arlington house. The same house that had appeared in countless posts, countless comments, countless assumptions. Cold air drifted across the yard. The trees stood bare against the winter sky. His phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages, calls, emails. Most offered congratulations, support, relief. He responded to very few. The victory didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet, almost anticlimactic. Months of conflict had ended not with a confrontation, but with paperwork, a judge, a signature, a ruling. The way most real disputes ended. Around 9 o'clock, Victoria called one last time. "You should know something." "What?" "Brooks' attorney contacted me." That surprised him slightly. What did he want? "A copy of the final calculations." "The company damages?" "Yes." Xander stared into the darkness beyond the patio. The meaning was obvious. Preston Cole wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was evaluating risk, evaluating exposure, evaluating consequences. The conversation continued briefly, then ended. Afterward, Xander remained outside, thinking. The internet had spent months treating the situation like a contest, a battle, a spectacle. The court had treated it differently. The court had treated it like a series of facts. Facts connected to records. Records connected to reality. Reality connected to consequences. Simple, unremarkable, effective. His phone vibrated one final time. A text from Melissa Grant. Only one sentence, short enough to fit entirely on the screen. The board voted unanimously not to let this happen again. Xander read it twice, then locked the phone, because although the divorce was effectively over, another decision still remained. Hamilton Crest Holdings now had a choice, and whatever choice the company made next could determine how the final chapter of the story would truly end. 6 months later, very few people were still talking about the divorce. The internet had moved on. It always did. New controversies appeared. New scandals emerged. New stories captured attention. The endless cycle continued. The posts that once generated thousands of comments now sat buried beneath newer content. The podcasts stopped mentioning Brooke. The blogs stopped writing updates. The public eventually lost interest. Reality remained. Reality always remained. On a cool spring morning, Xander Hamilton stood inside the conference room at Hamilton Crest Holdings. Sunlight streamed through the windows overlooking the pond behind the building. The same pond he had stared at months earlier while the divorce consumed headlines. Now, the atmosphere felt entirely different. Calmer, lighter, normal. Melissa Grant sat across the table reviewing quarterly reports. Thomas Reed flipped through financial summaries. Several department managers joined remotely. The company was growing again. Steadily, quietly, the way Xander preferred. The previous months had not been easy. The public campaign created disruptions. Some contracts had been delayed. Some relationships required repair. Several opportunities disappeared altogether. Yet the company survived. More than survived. It adapted. Clients returned, partners stayed. Trust rebuilt itself. Not because anyone launched a public relations campaign, because performance remained consistent. Deadlines were met. Commitments were honored. Promises were kept. Business in the end cared more about reliability than gossip. Thomas closed a report and smiled. Revenue is up 12%. Melissa nodded. Compliance reviews are complete. Another manager joined the conversation. New contracts are exceeding projections. The numbers spoke for themselves. Not dramatically, not explosively, steadily, solidly, the way healthy companies grow. When the meeting ended, most people left immediately. Xander remained by the window, watching sunlight ripple across the pond. The scene reminded him of something. The day they discovered Brooke's email. The day the first real crack appeared in her narrative. It felt much longer than 6 months ago. A different life. A different version of himself. His phone vibrated. A text message from Victoria Hayes. Simple, professional, as always. Board approved final settlement. Xander smiled faintly. The last remaining issue. Hamilton Crest Holdings had eventually negotiated a private resolution rather than pursue extended litigation. Not because the company lacked leverage, because endless conflict benefited nobody. The agreement required corrective actions, certain financial reimbursements, several formal acknowledgments. Nothing dramatic, nothing public. The company moved forward. That mattered more. Victoria had summarized it best months earlier. Winning wasn't the objective. Stability was. Xander placed the phone back in his pocket. Outside, ducks moved across the water. Exactly as they had during the worst moments of the case. The world rarely stopped for personal crises. Life simply continued. Eventually, so did people. A few weeks later, another change arrived. The Upper Arlington house sold. The decision surprised some people. The property had become symbolic. People expected him to keep it. Instead, he chose something different, something simpler, something quieter, a smaller home near the Scioto River, not far from downtown Columbus. Close to walking trails, close to coffee shops, close to everything he actually enjoyed. The new house lacked grand entrances, lacked dramatic views, lacked status. It felt peaceful. That was enough. One Saturday morning, he carried boxes into the new place himself. No moving company, no assistants, just a rented truck and a friend from college helping for the day. The process felt oddly satisfying. A reset. Not because the divorce defined him, because endings created space. Space allowed new routines, new habits, new priorities. Several weeks later, he established one. Every morning at 7:00 a.m., he walked to Staff's Coffee, the same location he had occasionally visited years earlier. The employees recognized him. The regular customers nodded politely. Nobody cared about court records. Nobody cared about social media. Nobody cared about headlines. People discussed weather, sports, traffic, normal things, healthy things. One morning, while reading a newspaper near the front window, Xander noticed a familiar name. Ethan Walsh, the journalist. A new article occupied the business section. Unrelated to the divorce, unrelated to Hamilton Crest Holdings. Just another piece of reporting. Xander stared at the byline for several seconds, then folded the paper. The article reminded him of something important. The entire outcome might have been different if one person had not asked questions, not taken sides, not defended anyone, simply asked questions. Questions led to facts. Facts led to clarity. Clarity eventually led to truth. That process mattered a lot. Later that afternoon, he met Victoria for lunch. Neither mentioned court immediately, neither wanted to. The legal battle felt distant now, finished, resolved. Eventually, however, Victoria smiled and asked, "Do you miss it?" Xander laughed, for perhaps the first time in months. Miss what? The chaos. He shook his head immediately. Not even a little. Victoria nodded. Good answer. Lunch continued. Normal conversation, normal life. The kind of life that becomes possible only after conflict ends. As they prepared to leave, Victoria paused, then asked another question, one she had never asked before. Do you regret staying quiet? The question deserved consideration. Months earlier, the answer might have been different. Now, it felt obvious. No. Victoria waited. Xander looked out the restaurant window toward the busy Columbus street. People hurried between buildings. Traffic lights changed, bicycles passed, life moved forward. Then he answered, If I had tried to fight every accusation, I would have spent all my energy arguing. Victoria smiled, and instead, I spent it preparing. Neither said anything for a moment. The distinction captured the entire story. Brooke had chased attention. Xander had preserved records. Brooke had relied on assumptions. Xander had relied on documentation. Brooke had tried to win publicly. Xander had prepared privately. Eventually, the difference became impossible to ignore. That evening, he returned home by the river. The sun was beginning to set. A golden light reflected across the water. Joggers moved along nearby trails. Families walked dogs. Children rode bicycles. The city felt alive, comfortably alive. He sat on the back patio with a cup of coffee. No court dates, no legal calls, no evidence binders, no emergency meetings. Just quiet. The kind of quiet people often underestimate, the kind that follows storms. His phone remained inside. For once, he didn't feel the need to check it. because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend, nothing left to explain. The truth had already done its work. And unlike social media, truth rarely needed an audience, it only needed time. Some people believe the loudest voice wins. This story showed something different. Xander Hamilton never won because he argued harder. He never won because he embarrassed someone publicly. He won because he stayed patient while facts accumulated. When emotions were running high, he focused on records. When public opinion shifted against him, he focused on evidence. And when the moment finally arrived, the truth had more weight than every accusation combined. Real life often works the same way. Many people experience situations where they are misunderstood, judged unfairly, or criticized before all the facts are known. In those moments, the temptation to react immediately can feel overwhelming. But sometimes the strongest response is preparation. Sometimes the smartest move is allowing documentation, consistency, and truth to speak when the time is right. Have you ever been in a situation where people believed a story about you before hearing the full truth? If so, how did you handle it? Share your experience in the comments. Your story may help someone else facing a similar challenge. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, strategy, and real-world justice, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's story shows what happens when a man everyone underestimated keeps one promise for 20 years and changes an entire town because of it.